What's good, y'all? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Danielle. Today I want to talk about Buddhism, more specifically why I chant, why I became Buddhist. I always get asked that question like, oh, you're Buddhist, what does that mean? What do you believe? So I just wanted to make this quick video and kind of give you some basics of Buddhism and why I started chanting. So y'all know I like to start at the beginning. First things first, Buddha means enlightened one or enlightened being. The original Buddha was a man named Siddhartha Gautama. He actually lived between the 5th and 4th century BCE. He was said to be an Indian prince, and when he was born, his father actually got his natal chart done, and the astrologer told him that he was going to be a great spiritual leader. So his father did not want that for him. He wanted him to follow in his footsteps and be a great king and a great warrior. He actually tried to shield Siddhartha from anything that he thought would make him want to go down the spiritual road. So he never let him see suffering or death or old age. He did not study the religious text or anything like that. So eventually he did grow up, and he left and he saw suffering, he saw poverty, he saw old age, he saw death, he saw sickness, and he didn't understand it, but he wanted to. So he made a vow to not only understand suffering, but to end suffering for all people. He became an ascetic. He basically went through a lot of pain and suffering to try to understand it, and eventually he did meditate, and he was able to understand the meaning of life and the meaning of suffering, and he attained Buddhahood, as we like to call it. So the Buddha actually spent 45 years writing and teaching different lessons. Actually predicted that eventually his teachings would stop having an impact on the world, and at that time a new Buddha would emerge. Cut to Nichiren Daishonin. Nichiren Daishonin was actually a Japanese priest in 13th century, about 1,000 years after the original Buddha. He was in feudal Japan. He saw that Buddhism had gotten so misinterpreted, that there were so many different schools and the people were still suffering. So he wanted to know, what was the Buddha trying to teach us? What is the true teachings of the Buddha? What was his message? So he studied all of the sutras, and he realized that the Lotus Sutra, which was the last of the Buddha's teachings, was the highest of the Buddha's teachings. He came to this conclusion because this is the only sutra that states that all people can attain Buddhahood. All people, even including women, which was unheard of up until then. This was a time when the priests were super corrupt. They were making the people pay them to pray. They were the only ones that were allowed to read religious material, and there was a lot of suffering. Like I said, this was feudal Japan. So by Nichiren coming out and saying, hey guys, we've had it wrong, the Lotus Sutra is actually the true teaching of the Buddha, this was a life threatening for him. Leaders were basically like, get down or lay down. Like, you're going to follow our God, you're going to follow our teachings, you're going to follow our religion, and if you don't, we'll kill you. So by going against the grain, it was a super brave thing for him to do. He actually did stand up, and he got exiled. He was sentenced to death. He almost lost his head a couple of times, and he got sent off to live on this deserted island where he was expected to die. During his exile, he actually wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters to his followers, encouraging them, and these letters letters are super profound and are still relevant to today in this day and age. He was able to come to the conclusion that even chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra can awaken someone to the fact that they have a Buddha nature. So that is why we chant NAM MYOHO RENGE KYO. It basically translates to devotion to the mystic law of the Lotus Sutra, or devotion to the mystic law of cause and effect through the teachings of the Buddha. Renge means lotus flower, and it's a metaphor. Lotus flowers actually produce fruit and flowers at the same time, so that speaks to the simultaneity of cause and effect. They also grow in really muddy waters, so that lets us know that we can create beauty in our life even amongst the sufferings of everyday life. I started chanting because I was in a really dark place. I was super depressed. I was very unhappy. I had been through a lot in my life, including homelessness, living in shelters, abusive relationships, you name it, I probably have seen it. I was talking to a friend. He had been practicing for about 10 years, and we were talking about prayer one day, and he was telling me that he chanted, and my initial reaction was,
like Tina Turner? Wait, like Tina Turner? Like in What's Love Got to Do with It? Like in that movie?
And he's like, well, yeah, basically it's the same thing. So he taught me about it, he taught me what it meant, and he encouraged me to try it. It took him about 2 years to get me to actually chant, but once I did, I fell in love with how it made me feel. I went to a meeting, and in this meeting I was surrounded by so many different people, so many different races and nationalities, and that in itself was kind of like amazing to me. When we sat down and everyone introduced themselves, I realized that there were people with masters and people that were doctors and PhDs, and I'm like, I'm so ordinary and plain. I felt out of place at first. When we got into the discussion, it was all about how even ordinary people have value, and they are treasure towers, and we all have a mission, and we all have our own journey. It compared the cherry, peach, plum, and damson blossoms, which are all beautiful in their own right, but they all blossom at different times of the year, and they all have different purposes. They all produce really delicious fruit, but they're all different, and they all are of value. And it just really spoke to me, and it resonated with me to the point where I just started crying. Like, I didn't even speak in that meeting, but I just started crying and crying and crying because I never felt so at home in a place ever. So I think that is the moment Buddhism really changed my life. Kind of like Tina Turner made the change that she did with leaving her abusive situation and, you know, starting something that was kind of unheard of for a melanated woman to, like, you know, get into rock and roll, and everybody was telling her like, no, it won't work, I don't see that happening. She still had the courage to do it and to try it. That is what Buddhism did for me as well. So some common misconceptions is that we worship the Buddha or that we pray to the Buddha. We actually do not have any deities in Nichiren Buddhism. We do not pray or chant to the Buddha, and we do not even meditate or stare at the Buddha statue. Now, we do chant in front of what is called the Gohanzen, which translates to object of devotion. We look at this like a mirror, so it is a way for us to observe our own mind. We do not think that it has special powers or that it can give us any special blessings. It's basically a scroll, and it has NAM MYOHO RENGE KYO, Nichiren, written down the center of the scroll. And that is to remind us that we too, ordinary people, can obtain Buddhahood just like Nichiren and the original Buddha did. We also do not believe in a heaven and a hell in a physical sense. There are 10 life states or life conditions, hell being the lowest and Buddhahood being the highest. Hell is a life state of depression and pain and suffering, not necessarily a place. Heaven is also one of the life states where you experience relative happiness. So happiness that is based off of things or people or relationships, but that happiness at the same time is fleeting. True happiness is when you are unshaken by anything that happens in life. We believe that happiness is not outside of yourself, and by chanting NAM MYOHO RENGE KYO, you can tap into that internal life force, that Buddha nature, bring forth the wisdom to make great causes and get great effects. With Nichiren Buddhism, we believe that you can change your karma by chanting NAM MYOHO RENGE KYO.